People who have lied on their resume and got the job. What did you lie about and how did it eventually turn out? Not me. But I had a friend who lied about his work experience and got a job with Hewlett-Packard. The thing was, he was super smart and knowledgeable about computers. So he was capable of doing the job they hired him for. He worked for them for maybe 4 or 5 years and it was a really sweet gig. Especially for someone right out of high school. Corporate housing. Car. Free meals in the cafeteria. All kinds of crazy perks because this was before the tech industry got saturated and his skills were in demand. It was maybe 1995 or so. They eventually found out and fired him. But it was a pretty good run for a 19-year-old kid with no higher education. So, I have successfully lied about the duration and work of previous posts. I've never lied about actually working at those places. But I have definitely gotten fired from one place without updating my LinkedIn or resume. So that when I got hired at the next place, they thought I had basically closed the door on the last position and moved right into the new one. Note: this has significantly diminishing returns the longer you go with it. I can speak to personal experience there. Not me, but a family friend growing up. He had just been hired as CEO of a multi-million-dollar company when it was discovered that he lied about being on the tennis team in college. His college didn't have a tennis team until 6 years after he graduated. He was immediately fired. Crazy how little that would have mattered in terms of his qualifications for the job. It was just the fact that he lied. Told her I was fluent in German. It wasn't even relevant to the job nor the whole interview. But she told me that being fluent in English wasn't impressive anymore nowadays. Her English was pretty bad. Ironically. So I told her that. Took her by surprise for a bit before asking me to describe my day in German. So I recited Rammstein lyrics from Reese Reese, my favorite song of theirs, confidently. I got the job. I was so glad that she didn't check the correct translation. And B, she never asked for more demonstrations all throughout my staying there. My backup plan was Icelandic. I could sing Sigur Rós Alpha verbatim wahaha, but thought that might be too extreme. This is an opposite story when I was hiring a lead coder for my company. I was so sick and tired of getting resumes from people that were literally filled with bullshit that I turned into a game for my own personal amusement. I got a resume that the gentleman listed he spoke 11 languages, one of them was Swahili. I knew 3 words of Swahili. I had learned how to say release the prisoners in Swahili from an episode of Gilligan's Island, Aniyashawapangaji. I called him in and set up an interview in my office. Sure enough, when he came in, I tested him and his Swahili with my brief phrase, and sure as shit, he spoke Swahili. I ended up hiring him, and he was the best coder I have ever hired without a doubt. I never would have called him for the interview had I not absolutely thought he was full of shit. A couple years ago, I was filling out a resume for a lab tech job on some job board. It had a pop-up that required you to answer some questions before sending the application. Basic stuff like are you at least 18, etc. It was pretty obviously a questionnaire to root unqualified candidates out before the resume was looked at by a human. The last question was, do you have prior experience in chemistry? I didn't. But check the box anyway. I figured it was the only way to get a human being to look at my resume. And if they called me out on it in the interview, I'd own up to lying. Worst case scenario, I'm back where I started. I get to the interview, and it's a panel interview in front of 3 PhD chemists. They ask me about my specific chemistry experience. Specifically otium, which is what they cared about. Given that the sciences tend to have some friendly competition, I figured I'd play to my audience. I said, well, I don't have any, but I have a degree in physics and in my opinion that's even better, so really you guys are getting a deal. Double quote. They loved my answer and said that even though I wasn't strictly qualified, they thought I'd be a great culture fit. I've been working there as a chemist for a little over 2 years. Still don't know shit about organic chemistry. I put a trivial lie on my resume. I took guitar lessons for 2-3 years. Starting when I was like 6 years old. When interviewing for my current job in 1997, I had on my resume that I played guitar. I hadn't actually played guitar in over 15 years. One guy that interviewed me was very much into guitar and started asking me questions about it. I worked very hard to change the subject, which thankfully he went with. Me and my friend were both looking for an IT company to have our internships at. We may have beefed up our resume a bit in terms of our proficiency in some web development languages. I told them I was competent in using JavaScript and Node.js while she told them she was competent in using PHP. We got in. And first day on the job, they gave us a project to work on using the languages we mentioned in our resume. At the end of the day we showed them our output, which isn't much, and our supervisor was not happy. And he said if you both had applied as an employee, I would have told you both there's the door. Get out. In the end we were given a week to learn the languages while working on the project and we finished our internship learning a lot from them. So it all went well. I needed more work experience so I said I worked at an animal shelter when I was actually only a volunteer. I did most of the jobs an actual employee would do at the shelter. I just wasn't paid for it. It helped get me my first job and second. Neither job had anything to do with animals or anything similar. I just need to have some form of experience in something to make it look good. I may have also called myself a child caregiver as a fancy way to say babysitter. I lied about the length of employment for pretty much every job I've had. And I inflated my responsibilities at each job to sound like I was more important than I was. It worked great. I've never had anyone fact check my resume. I've had people call my references. But they all spoke about my personality and work ethic as opposed to what my day-to-day duties were or how long I actually worked at the job. Maybe I'm just lucky. But it seems like most employers just take your resume at face value, assuming it's not 100% made up and that you can conduct yourself well at an interview. I lied about my age when I applied for a summer job as a copywriter. I was 17 so I would have needed an expensive permit to hold down a full-time job in my country and my age would be obviously undesirable to many companies. Regardless, I sent my resume, posing as 18. To many fresher positions I was definitely underqualified for and got a call back from a promising SME for an interview. Once there, I explained the situation, i.e. my age and limitations. I didn't lie about any of my qualifications but travel etc was a problem for me, only to be met with a smile and an invitation to continue the interview. Apparently, they liked my tenacity and enjoyed the angle I presented in my resume so they hired me full-time for the summer while paying for my labor card and training. They called me an investment. I wouldn't recommend dishonesty but don't be afraid to shoot your shot sometimes at the expense of some mild distortion in your resume. It seems as though willingness to work hard and learn ultimately play the biggest role in corporate success. Literally everything that was important. I made fake companies I had worked for related experience, used my friends' cell phones as numbers they could call. Fake employment verification letters. I used my sister's high school transcripts and accolades to bolster my resume. Forged a DRS note to remove restrictions. At the time I had a cast on, nothing on my resume was my own. I really had no choice though it was an incredibly good job and at 28 per hour to start at 19 with a kid and no tangible work experience I had to do what I had to do. 8 years later I'm the head coordinator of my department and I have 3 kids. A wife. 3 dogs. And was able to buy a house 3 years ago. So it worked out well. I wanted to make a career change into data science but never took the time to learn any query languages. I was going to get to it eventually. Then a data science statistician job opened in my agency for 40% more pay than what I was making at the time. I applied for it. And wrote in my resume that I had completed some e-learning courses on various query languages, but I told myself I would do it very soon. I didn't even think I'd get the interview and long story short I got the job without ever learning those query languages. Fortunately I picked it up really fast and I'm in a much happier place with a more promising career path. I accidentally lied about being done school. I did a 2-year IT program and I was only missing Calculus 1 to graduate. I made my resume and in education had it say I was graduated. Just so I could see how it would like on the resume. Thing is, I forgot to change that to say I only had 1 class left until I graduate. So I applied for all these jobs and got a job 2 provinces away. I moved there and I worked for a week until HR asked me for my diploma. Which I didn't have. I realized my FCK up and didn't even know what to say. So I lied. Said I had all my classes but I didn't have my diploma yet as I never applied to get it, which is something you have to do at my school. That went on for 3 weeks until I decided to just come clean to my boss. So eventually my boss, his boss, and his boss, CTO, had a meeting with HR for like 2 hours where they argued about what to do with me. I felt like a complete retard because I was new at a company and I basically started a fight between our managers and HR managers, not about me, but about HR trying to tell us what we can do with our employees. HR wanted to fire me, but eventually they settled on a 3-day suspension. I remember being stressed out for weeks and just thinking of ways I could possibly forge my diploma. With a bunch of luck I had a pretty solid line cook resume in nice restaurants by the time I was halfway through college. When my brother got out of jail my junior year he moved to my college town and applied to a bunch of restaurants using that resume experience. He got a job at the prototypical college breakfast place. I don't think he made it through even 1 weekend. He was so surprised how hard it was cooking a shitload of eggs and potatoes on those hangover brunch days, haha. I lied about having a degree in my resume. I went to college but didn't finish when was 3 classes short and my GPA was too low, 2.8, to graduate with pride. I got the job and was never asked for transcripts or any other kind of proof. Every morning I went to work for a whole year anticipating he would get found out and fired. It never happened and I stopped worrying. Instead of worrying I put 110% into my work and dedicated my life to mastering it. I didn't have a wife or kids at the time so my motivation to work harder than anyone else was I didn't like the feeling of being a fraud or what they call imposter syndrome. Double quote. Every day I had off I had anxiety of not knowing if I'd be found out when I go to work next morning. 11 years later and I'm still working at the company now as a director of my department in charge of 45 employees. I finally got my degree after about year 5 but kept it hush and didn't tell anyone. I don't recommend anyone doing this but it worked for me so oh well. Not me, but a friend named Mike who's a teacher. Mike was struggling to find a teaching job in his school board. So he convinced a successful teacher friend of his to help with Mike's resume. His successful friend forwarded a copy of his resume to Mike, with the intention that Mike could use the formatting and learn the kind of teacher speak that he used to get a job. Well, Mike simply changes the name at the top of the resume to his own and saves the file. He ends up getting a ton of interviews because successful friend had a killer set of experiences and degrees. One of the interviewers asks who is successful friend. His name is on the file name of your resume. Mike backpedals, saying that he only used successful friend's resume formatting. And Mike gets the job. This was about 4 years ago. And Mike is still going strong at hating everything about teaching. But that's for a different thread. I lied about being a bartender. Said I worked at all kinds of restaurants around Australia figuring they wouldn't fact check me from the US. All jobs give you a little training to get familiar with what is going on so I just had to be focused and learn very quickly. They would ask me to make pretty basic drinks and if I didn't have time to Google it without them seeing I would just say how do you make yours? I want to keep the drinks consistent for the regulars they would show me and I would write it down. Eventually I was on my own on a Friday night and oh man was it tough. When I was really screwing up I would just make it extra strong and a lot of people didn't mind as much. All in all it worked out and I stayed 2 years. I lied about being an inventory manager for my previous club when I applied for a job at a new nightclub that had just opened up. My only previous experience was barbecuing. Even faked an email from my previous boss confirming it. I got the job. Did amazing at it. Everyone loved me. but was fired 6 months later because I discovered that the ASBAR spouts were pouring 10% too much on the rail bottles, costing the club about $5,000 a week. Never mind the Hennessy XO pouring doubles on every pour. I spent an entire week recalibrating every station in the club, there were about 40, and then went and explained to the boss what I had done and why, and since I just worked about 70 hours in the past week fixing the stations, I was going to take a week off. I mentioned that if I had done it right they wouldn't have any missing booze at the end of the week. When I came back, they took me aside and explained that I was being let go because during the week I was gone, it was the first week they weren't missing about $5,000 worth of alcohol, so I must have been stealing it. It's more fluff than it is lying. But in college I used to be a delivery driver for a Pizza Hut. I always said that I handled finances and was a trusted logistical agent for a multinational company. I actually said that in a recent interview for an internal position that's open. When the interviewers asked where it was and I explained, they all burst out laughing and said they loved how I described it. I'm still waiting to hear back, but I think that made me memorable, at least lol. To get my first bartending job I included on my resume that I worked for a company that bartended at private events and made custom cocktails for 4 years. The name of the company was the name of the dorm I lived in my last 2 years of college, and my contacts were my roommates. The thing is, we threw a lot of parties with custom cocktails and I'd gone to bartending school, so I felt like I had the necessary skills. The only lie was that we were a company. The job was in another country, so I wasn't that worried. It worked out great. Not sure if this counts per se, but right after graduating undergrad I went right into grad school and burned out quickly. I ended up getting dismissed from my program. But while I was finishing up with my last classes I applied for a job in my field and my resume still had that I was attending grad school on it. They did ask about it. I have the job now. I am slightly worried that in the future they might question whether or not I have my master's degree yet and whether it might bar me from continuing here or getting any promotions. But for now I really don't even need it, and frankly I don't think I should, because I really don't think I would have learned anything I hadn't already learned in undergrad. My mother didn't lie, but it worked out for her benefit. She worked her way up from waitress to GM of a fairly large hotel. Then was given responsibility for 2 hotels. It wasn't until that point that they decided to see if she was actually qualified. She was by no means qualified. That being said, she had been doing the job for years successfully, so she kept her job. Oddly, the requirements for GM were higher than those of the regional director position she eventually reached. I guess they figured that you couldn't be a regional director without having been a GM. So, I once applied for a job at an IT store, selling like Raspberry Pi and things like that. I informed the manager of the store that I was studying IT in college, and that I had worked in a similar environment. I also told him that I was proficient at using computer technology, creating my own computer systems and coding robotics etc, when in reality I had no idea what I was doing. I assumed it would be a piece of pie to inform customers. Oh, how wrong I was. My first day someone approached me about a Raspberry Pi, asking what it was. I informed them that it was a memory stick. There were several more encounters like this over the week that I worked there, until I was fired for knowing absolutely nothing. I have a buddy who flunked out of college after his first year. He was going for engineering, but played Counter-Strike instead of studying. He put on his resume that he earned a B.S. in engineering, and landed a job at Lockheed Martin in their hydraulics division. And now he works at SpaceX, and made it through their latest culling. He learned a lot on the job, and is now actually a valuable team member. But still has no degree. I have a PhD in STEM and he makes more than I do. Bro had a work-related accident and went on the work accident insurance thing. Once he was ready to return to work, he returned to school. Then couldn't find job. So, basically, accident stop, school time, then another few months of no work. He couldn't find any work, and he was running out of insurance weeks. So he looked up the news, Found a company that recently went bankrupt, which happened to have some jobs that was close to what he already did. So he looked up a bit more info. Then he removed all of the work accident stuff. Replaced it with worked at bankrupt place as a job there. Contact info unavailable due to bankruptcy. First resume he sent, he got a call. He refused the offer because he got a second offer that was better. He worked there until he found something better elsewhere many months after. Which he worked there until one of his friend offered him a job. Which he still have many years after and still like. I've never lied about where I worked because that would be more trouble than I feel like going through. However, I have lied about positions I've held being promoted to, as my references in management are actually co-workers who actually held the position I lied about being in but were willing to back me up. It's always worked for me. The only thing is I've worked in wildly different industries for each job I've had. But keep them on the resume to show potential employers how I've managed to learn skills I've put on my resume. And X200B. Also, I helped my best friend's ex get into well-known school of fashion that has an LA campus by writing a letter of recommendation for her that the school never bothered to verify, as I left my contact information on it. I gassed her up pretty well in that letter. And it worked because she got accepted and is on track to graduate RN. Not me. But I was working on a low-budget independent movie. Someone who was recommended by the costume designer to be the assistant costume designer submitted a resume to the line producer. On the list of their credits was a movie the line producer had previously worked on. And the line producer didn't recognize this person's name at all. So she called her up and called her out on lying. She copped to it right away, saying the costume designer said I should add it to my resume to bulk it up. And that since she was the costume designer on that movie, if she was ever asked, she'd back up the lie. Just tough luck that the producer of the movie caught that resume. Hired her anyway. The costume designer wanted to work with her. And we would have brought her aboard anyway. All it really did was lower her pay to entry level. Then fired her and the costume designer 2 days later because the executive producer of the movie ran into a girl he had a crush on in high school who worked in fashion, so he hired her on the spot to be the new costume designer to show off. I used to do background screening. We would have to comb through applicants' work history, verify they worked where they said they did, and do references. Most importantly, we verified their education. One company, a major tech company in Canada, surprised their long-time employees to submit their credentials. Verifying education in India is a very long and frustrating process. We once got a verification back 2 years after we sent it. This very high up executive submitted his credentials and it stuck out to me as very suspicious. A few Google searches would tell me he bought a diploma from a diploma mill. He must have had the skills, because he rose from entry level to an executive. We submitted our findings back to the company. I'm not sure what happened next, but he built his career on a lie.